Long before empires dreamed of conquest, before steel towers pierced the endless sky, before the thunder of aircraft engines would shake the earth like the footsteps of mechanical gods, there was only the Volga, ancient, eternal, indifferent to the ambitions of men. It carved its path through the heart of a continent, carrying the whispers of forgotten civilizations toward the distant Caspian Sea. The river remembers everything. It remembers the Khazars who built their trading posts along its banks, the Mongol horsemen who watered their ponies in its shallows, the Cossack warriors who fortified the bluffs overlooking its muddy waters. It remembers the Tsars and the commissars, the prayers and the proclamations, the hopes and the graves of 1,000 generations who lived and died believing their moment was eternal. But if you listen closely to the Volga's murmur, you will hear something else. The echo of a single name, spoken in 100 languages, whispered in reverence and terror. Stalingrad. Once, this place was called Tsaritsyn, a Cossack fortress perched on the river's western bank like a watchful hawk. The steppe stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of grass beneath an infinite sky, broken only by the occasional windmill or watchtower. Here, where 3 rivers converged, traders gathered to exchange salt and fish, grain and furs, while the wind carried the scent of wild honey and distant rain. Time moved differently then, measured not in minutes but in seasons, not in deadlines but in the patient rhythm of planting and harvest. Children grew to adulthood counting summers by the height of sunflowers, winters by the thickness of ice on the river. Death came naturally, from age, from disease, from the harsh beauty of the steppe, but it came gently, wrapped in the familiar embrace of earth and sky. Then came the revolution, and with it, the transformation. Ere Stalin's iron will, Tsaritsyn shed its old skin like a serpent, emerging reborn as something harder, more angular, more terrible in its industrial majesty. Smokestacks rose from the riverbank like the spires of a new cathedral, breathing fire and shadow into the endless sky. The tractor factory stretched along the waterfront, its assembly lines humming with the rhythm of progress, while the red October steel works forged the sinews of a socialist paradise from molten metal and human sweat. The city grew with the relentless hunger of a living thing, consuming the steppe, digesting villages, transforming pastoral dreams into urban reality. Workers arrived by the thousands, peasants from Ukraine, engineers from Moscow, true believers from every corner of the Soviet Union, all drawn by the promise of building something greater than themselves. They lived in hastily constructed apartments, shopped in communal stores, sent their children to schools where they learned to read using texts that proclaimed the glory of the workers' state. Yet even in this temple of industry, humanity persisted. Lovers walked along the Volga's embankment in the evening light, watching barges drift downstream loaded with grain from Siberia. Mothers pushed their children on swings in parks carved from former noble estates, while old men played chess beneath statues of revolutionary heroes. The river still flowed, still carried the seasons in its current, still whispered of permanence beneath the machinery's roar. The grain elevator stood like a concrete mountain beside the water, its silos reaching toward heaven with the confidence of Babel. Inside, wheat from a dozen republics waited to feed a hungry nation, golden kernels holding within themselves the hopes of farmers who trusted in the promise of collective abundance. The elevator's workers knew every grain by touch, could judge the quality on a harvest by the sound wheat made as it poured through the distribution chutes. To the north, Mamayev Kurgan rose from the steppe like the backbone of some buried giant, its slopes green with wild grass and scattered graves. Here, ancient Scythian princes lay buried with their horses and their gold, while more recent heroes of the Civil War slept beneath simple stone markers. The hill commanded the entire city, offering views that stretched to the horizon in every direction, north to the factory district, south to the grain terminals, west across the steppe to infinity, east across the Volga to Asia's vast expanse. The factory district hummed with constant motion. Shift changes brought rivers of workers flowing through the streets, their faces blackened with honest soot, their eyes bright with the satisfaction of useful labor. The Red October works never slept, its furnaces glowing like dragons' hearts, transforming raw ore into the steel that would build tractors, bridges, railway lines, the infrastructure of a new world being born from the ashes of the old. Children played in courtyards between the apartment blocks, their games interrupted by the factory whistles that marked the passage of time more precisely than any clock. They learned to distinguish between the sounds of different machinery, could tell by the pitch of a turbine whether it was running smoothly or needed attention. This was their universe, bounded by river and steppe, measured by production quotas and 5-year plans, illuminated by the promise that they were building paradise on earth. In the summer evenings, when the heat rose from the pavement in shimmering waves, families would gather on their balconies to catch whatever breeze might drift in from the water. The old ones would tell stories of the time before, when nobles owned the land and peasants bent their backs to enrich distant masters. The young ones listened with the patience of those who know they live in history's fulfillment, the generation that would inherit the completed revolution. The Volga flowed on, unchanged and eternal, carrying within its waters the memory of everything that had been and the promise of everything yet to come. Fishermen still cast their nets at dawn, still sang the old songs as they hauled in their catch. Tugboat captains still knew every sandbar and current, still read the river's moods like scripture written in foam and shadow. But something else was stirring in the world beyond the steppe. Far to the west, beyond the forests of Belorussia, beyond the fields of Poland, beyond the ancient boundaries of civilization itself, other smokestacks were rising, other machines were turning, other dreams were taking shape in steel and flame. The 20th century was awakening to its full terrible potential, and the age of innocence, even industrial innocence, was drawing to its close. The river knew. It always knows. In the subtle shift of currents, in the behavior of migrating birds, in the quality of light reflecting from its surface, the Volga carried warnings that only the very wise or very old could read. Change was coming to the city of steel and dreams, change that would test every foundation, challenge every assumption, transform every life it touched. Soon, the river would run red with more than sunset. Thunder rolls across the Polish plains, but this is not the thunder of storms. This is the sound of history accelerating, of the 20th century finally revealing its true face to a world that thought it had already seen the worst. In the Chancellery in Berlin, a failed painter turned prophet of apocalypse studies maps with the intensity of a man possessed by visions of destiny. Adolf Hitler sees the world as a cosmic chess game, with himself as the sole player worthy of moving the pieces. His eyes, pale and burning with fanatic certainty, trace the borders of nations as if they were mere suggestions, temporary inconveniences to be swept aside by superior will. The East calls to him with the promise of Lebensraum, living space for a master race that exists more in his fevered imagination than in biological reality. When we march into Russia, he tells his assembled generals, men whose uniforms glitter with medals earned in an earlier, more civilized war, we kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. The words hang in the air like incense in a cathedral of steel and hatred, sanctifying the greatest crime in human history before it has even begun. Operation Barbarossa takes its name from a medieval emperor who drowned while crusading in distant lands, but Hitler sees only the conquest, not the drowning. On paper, the plan possesses the terrible beauty of mathematical perfection. 3 army groups, 3.8 million men, 3,350 tanks, 7,400 artillery pieces, 2,770 aircraft, the largest military machine ever assembled, pointed like a spear at the heart of the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht that gathers along the eastern frontier in the spring of 1941 believes in its own invincibility with the faith of religious converts. They have conquered Poland in weeks, brought France to its knees in 40 days, scattered the British army at Dunkirk like leaves before a hurricane. These soldiers wear their victories like armor, certain that superior training, better equipment, and Teutonic discipline will prove decisive against the barbarous hordes of Bolshevism. General Friedrich Paulus adjusts his monocle as he studies the maps spread across the wooden table in his command post. A Prussian aristocrat by birth and bearing, he possesses the methodical mind of a staff officer and the cautious soul of a man who has seen too much of war to retain any romantic illusions. Unlike his Führer, Paulus understands that Russia is not merely large, it is vast beyond human comprehension, a continent disguised as a country, where armies can march for months without reaching anything that matters. But orders are orders, and duty is duty. The 6th Army, Paulus's command, will drive southeast toward Stalingrad, while Army Group Center thrusts toward Moscow and Army Group North advances on Leningrad. 3 simultaneous offensives across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, ambitious beyond reason perhaps, but then reasonable men do not attempt to conquer the world. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin paces the floor of his office like a caged bear, his paranoia and his genius locked in mortal combat. The purges of the 1930s have decapitated the Red Army, sending its most experienced commanders to face firing squads or slow death in the Gulag. Marshal Tukhachevsky, the brilliant architect of modern Soviet military doctrine, lies buried in an unmarked grave, executed for treason. He never committed by a leader who saw conspiracy in every shadow, treachery in every competent subordinate. The Red Army that must face the Wehrmacht consists largely of peasant conscripts led by political appointees, men whose primary qualification is ideological purity rather than military skill. Their equipment is often obsolete, their training inadequate, their morale undermined by the knowledge that retreat might be punished as severely as defeat. Yet within this demoralized force, kernels of future greatness already exist. Officers like Vasily Chuikov, who will learn to transform weakness into strength, fear into fury. The summer of 1941 unfolds like a fever dream of conquest. German armies slice through Soviet defenses as if they were made of paper, encircling entire armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners who march westward in columns that stretch beyond the horizon. Minsk falls, then Smolensk, then Kiev. Ancient cities surrendering to the thunder of panzer divisions with a speed that surprises even the German high command. But the very success of the offensive begins to reveal its fatal flaw. Russia absorbs German divisions like a sponge absorbs water, drawing them deeper into a vastness that has no end. Supply lines stretch thinner with each victory, fuel becomes precious, ammunition scarce. The Wehrmacht discovers that conquering Russia is like trying to hold mercury in one's hands. The more forcefully you grasp, the more completely it slips away. Winter arrives early in 1941, catching German soldiers still dressed for a summer campaign. Their uniforms, designed for the mild climate of Western Europe, provide little protection against the Siberian winds that turn spit to ice before it hits the ground. Frostbite claims more casualties than enemy action, and the invincible Wehrmacht learns that nature recognizes no master race. The offensive stalls just short of Moscow, exhausted armies grinding to a halt like clockwork toys whose springs have finally unwound. Hitler, faced with the collapse of his blitzkrieg strategy, makes the first of many decisions that will ultimately doom his 1,000-year Reich. He orders the army to hold every position, to yield not a single meter of conquered territory, to stand and die rather than retreat and live. But failure teaches lessons that success cannot. As 1942 dawns across the frozen steppes, the German war machine undergoes its own evolution. New strategies emerge from the ashes of old certainties and the focus shifts southward toward the oil fields of the Caucasus that could fuel the Reich's war machine for generations. Stalingrad, Stalin's city on the Volga, becomes not just another objective, but a symbol. For Hitler, proof that German will can triumph over Soviet resistance. For Stalin, evidence that the revolution can withstand any test. The generals gather around their maps once more, but the mood has changed. The easy confidence of 1941 has been tempered by the harsh schooling of a Russian winter. Paulus, promoted now to command of the Sixth Army, studies intelligence reports that speak of Soviet factories beyond the Urals, of production lines working around the clock to replace every tank destroyed, every plane shot down, every rifle lost. Yet the machine of war, once set in motion, develops its own momentum. Orders flow down from Berlin. The Sixth Army will advance on Stalingrad, capture the city, cut the Volga supply line, open the path to the Caucasus oil fields. On paper, it looks achievable. One more river crossing, one more industrial city to be added to the Wehrmacht's growing collection of conquered territories. The men who will fight this battle are already in motion, columns of grey uniformed soldiers marching eastward through the dust of summer, their boots keeping time to songs that speak of home and victory, fatherland and duty. They carry photographs of sweet hair, thus letters from mothers, iron crosses earned in earlier campaigns. Most believe they will be home by Christmas, the war won, the future secured for 1,000 years. Behind them, the logistical miracle of modern warfare unfolds. Supply trains carrying ammunition and fuel, field hospitals equipped with the latest medical innovations, communication networks that can coordinate the movement of entire armies across thousands of miles. This is war as the 20th century has perfected it. Precise, mathematical, utterly destructive. The summer heat shimmers across the steppe like a mirage, and in that wavering air, the outline of approaching armies becomes visible. What began as distant thunder now resolves into the grinding of tank treads, the drone of aircraft engines, the rhythmic march of boots across 1,000 miles of conquered earth. The wolves are gathering, drawn by the scent of prey, and their hunger has grown vast with feeding. August 23rd, 1942. The date burns itself into memory like a brand pressed against tender flesh, marking the moment when one world dies and another is born in fire and smoke. At 6:00 a.m., as the first pale light of dawn touches the Volga's surface, the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet rises from airfields across the steppe like a mechanical plague of locusts, 600 aircraft strong, their engines drowning out the morning songs of birds that will never sing again. The citizens of Stalingrad wake to the sound of air raid sirens, a wailing that seems to rise from the earth itself, as if the steppe were crying out in prophetic grief. Children stumble from their beds, parents gather them close, and for a moment, one last, precious moment, the city exists as it always has, a place where people live and love and hope for tomorrow. Then the bombs begin to fall. The Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s arrive in waves, their formations dark against the morning sky, like the shadow of death's wing passing over the land. Their bomb bays open with mechanical precision, releasing high explosives and incendiaries in carefully calculated patterns designed to maximize destruction and terror. The first bombs strike the oil storage tanks along the riverfront, and suddenly, the Volga itself catches fire. Imagine it, a river burning, water that has flowed for 10,000 years, suddenly ablaze, its surface rippling with flames that reach toward heaven like the prayers of the damned. Black smoke rises in columns that can be seen for 50 miles, blotting out the sun, turning day to a hellish twilight that glows red and orange and the color of despair. The wooden residential districts ignite like kindling. Houses that sheltered generations of families disappear in minutes, their timbers crackling with the fury of unconstrained combustion. The wind, as if summoned by some malevolent spirit, fans the flames and car. rise burning debris across the city, seeding new fires faster than human hands can extinguish them. In the factories, workers who arrived for the morning shift find themselves trapped between advancing flames and collapsing buildings. The Red October steelworks becomes a forge of human suffering, its furnaces joined by the greater furnace of war. Men who have spent their lives shaping metal with fire now flee from fire that threatens to reshape them into ash and memory. Families stream toward the Volga, seeking escape across water that offers no sanctuary. The riverbank becomes a scene from Dante's imagination. Thousands of people pressed against the burning water, children crying for parents lost in the smoke, old men collapsing from hearts broken by terror, mothers clutching infants to breasts that offer no protection from the apocalypse falling from the sky. The ferries that normally carry workers and cargo across the Volga are pressed into service as vessels of exodus. Overloaded beyond any measure of safety, they wallow in the burning water like dying whales, their decks packed with refugees who understand that drowning might be preferable to burning. Some of these boats make it across, others do not. The Stukas, diving like metallic hawks, target anything that moves on the water, their sirens adding their inhuman scream to the symphony of destruction. Captain Mikhail Radimtsev, commanding a regiment of naval infantry, still days away from the battle, later writes in his diary, "We could see the smoke from 80 kilometers away. The entire horizon was black, and the air tasted of oil and death. I knew then that we were not marching toward a battle, but toward the end of the world." By noon, 40,000 civilians are dead. By evening, the city center no longer exists as anything recognizable. The grand boulevards lined with Stalinist architecture have become anyone's of rubble, the parks filled with craters instead of flowers, the schools and hospitals transformed into mausoleums of shattered brick and twisted steel. Yet something remarkable happens in the midst of this devastation. As the flames consume their city, the people of Stalingrad do not simply flee. Workers from the tractor factory form volunteer fire brigades, battling blazes with garden hoses and determination. Teachers organize the evacuation of children, leading them through smoke-filled streets with the calm courage of shepherd guiding flocks through valley of shadow. Doctors perform surgery by candlelight in basement shelters, saving lives with instruments sterilized in fire. The grain elevator, that concrete mountain by the water, stands intact amid the destruction like a monument to human stubbornness. Its walls, thick enough to withstand any bombardment the Luftwaffe can deliver, shelter hundreds of refugees who have learned that sometimes salvation comes not from escape, but from endurance. Inside, among the golden wheat, children sleep on beds of grain while their parents keep watch, listening for the sound of aircraft engines that might herald another day of judgment. General Paulus, observing the destruction from his headquarters 30 kilometers west of the city, allows himself a moment of satisfaction. The preparatory bombardment has exceeded expectations. Stalingrad appears to be finished before the ground assault has even begun. His staff officers exchange congratulations, certain that the city will fall within days, possibly hours. But Paulus is a student of history, and history has taught him to be cautious about premature celebration. Through his binoculars, he watches the smoke rising from the Volga and wonders if they have created a graveyard or a fortress. Rubble, he knows, can provide better defensive positions than intact buildings. Men defending their homes fight differently than men defending distant territories. As night falls on August 23rd, the flames paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold, their light visible from aircraft flying at 20,000 feet. The Volga reflects this hellish illumination, its surface rippling with fire like the mirror of a fever dream. The ancient river, which has seen the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of civilizations, now witnesses the transformation of a Soviet industrial city into something harder, more terrible, more determined. In the basement shelters, in the ruins of apartments, in the concrete bunkers of the factory district, The survivors of August 23rd make a collective decision that will echo through history. They will not flee. They will not surrender. They will dig deeper into the rubble, deeper into the earth, deeper into themselves, and they will fight with the fury of the betrayed, the abandoned, the already dead. The city burns, but does not die. Instead, it transforms into something unprecedented in human warfare. A necropolis that breathes, a graveyard that shoots back, a funeral pyre that refuses to be extinguished. The Battle of Stalingrad has begun, not with the crash of opposing armies, but with the sound of a city learning to hate. In the distance, German artillery opens fire, adding the bass notes of heavy guns to the crackling soprano of flames. The Sixth Army is advancing, confident in their superiority, certain of their victory, unaware that they are marching not toward conquest, but toward a trap that will consume them as surely as fire consumes dry timber. As night deepens and the flames begin to subside, shadows move among the ruins, not fleeing civilians, but soldiers taking positions among the wreckage. The city burns, but it does not surrender. It waits, patient as a spider, for its enemies to come close enough to embrace. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 25th, boats slip across the burning Volga like phantoms crossing the river Styx. These are not the overcrowded ferries of fleeing civilians, but military craft carrying soldiers who row against the current of history itself. Each man knows he may never return, yet they come nonetheless, drawn by duty, by orders, by something deeper than either, the inexplicable human need to stand between home and hatred. General Vasily Chvikov crouches in the bow of the lead boat, his weathered face illuminated by the flames still dancing on the water's surface. At 52, he has already survived more wars than most men can count. The Russian Civil War, conflicts in China, the Spanish Civil War, where he learned to read the future in the smoke of burning cities. His eyes, pale as winter ice, hold the kind of coldness that comes not from cruelty, but from absolute clarity of purpose. The 62nd Army exists now more in name than reality, a collection of shattered regiments, replacement battalions, naval infantry units, pulled from distant fleets, factory workers who have traded their tools for rifles. They are not the elite guards divisions that parade through Red Square, but the anonymous multitude that keeps nations alive. Truck drivers and teachers, farmers and clerks, boys barely old enough to shave, and men old enough to be their grandfathers. Comrades, Chvikov's voice carries across the water, quiet but penetrating. We are not crossing the Volga to visit Stalingrad. We are crossing to defend it. Every man who sets foot on the western bank fights until victory or death. There is no third option. The words hang in the night air like an incantation, binding these men to a fate none of them fully understands. They are about to become participants in the most savage urban warfare in human history, a battle that will reduce combat to its most primitive elements, room by room, floor by floor, sometimes hand to hand in darkness so complete that enemies die without ever seeing each other's faces. The grain elevator looms before them as they approach the eastern bank, its concrete bulk riddled with shell holes but still standing, still defiant. Inside, 30 Soviet soldiers have been holding off attacks by an entire German regiment for 3 days. They are running out of ammunition, running out of water, running out of everything except the stubborn Russian refusal to acknowledge defeat. Senior Lieutenant Andrei Kozyanov commands this tiny garrison with the authority of a man who has already died and simply hasn't yet stopped fighting. His radioed reports to army headquarters have become the stuff of legend. We are holding the elevator. The Germans attack constantly. We beat them off. They attack again. We beat them off again. Send ammunition. No pleading, no despair, just the matter-of-fact tone of men doing their job in hell. The elevator's defense reveals the brutal mathematics of urban warfare. 30 men with rifles can hold a fortified position against hundreds of attackers, provided they are willing to die for each room, each floor, each pile of rubble. The Germans, trained for rapid advances across open terrain, discover that their tactical doctrine becomes useless when the battlefield is vertical, when every window might conceal a sniper, every doorway a trap. Meanwhile, in a basement headquarters that shakes with each artillery bombardment, Chuikov studies maps that change hourly as new ruins appear and old landmarks disappear. His task seems impossible: defend a city that no longer exists, using an army that exists more in hope than reality, against an enemy that has conquered half of Europe. But Chuikov possesses the rarest of military gifts, the ability to see opportunity within catastrophe. The destruction that horrifies civilians creates defensive positions that no engineer could design. Every pile of rubble becomes a fortress, every crater a strong point, every shattered building a maze where defenders hold every advantage except numbers. The first Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga on the night of August 29th, the 13th Guards Rifle Division, veterans of earlier battles, men who wear their unit's battle honors like armor against despair. They move through the burning city like ghosts, taking positions in buildings that exist only as skeletal frameworks, digging foxholes among the dead, preparing defensive positions in what was once a park where children played. Lieutenant Vasily Zaitsev arrives with these reinforcements, carrying a sniper rifle and a reputation for shooting that borders on the supernatural. A former shepherd from the Urals, he learned marksmanship hunting wolves in forests where a missed shot might mean starvation. Now he adapts these skills to hunting a different kind of predator in an urban wilderness where patience and precision matter more than courage. Zaitsev's first kill comes at dawn on September the 2nd, a German officer studying the city through binoculars, confident in his distance from Soviet positions. The shot, taken from over 400 meters through the smoke and haze of burning buildings, removes the officer's head with surgical precision. Within hours, word spreads through both armies. The ruins have eyes, and death comes to those who show themselves carelessly. The sniper war becomes a battle within the battle. Individual duels of skill and nerve played out across a landscape that resembles the surface of an alien planet. German marksmen, trained in the forests of Bavaria, find their traditional techniques useless in an environment where sightlines change hourly as buildings collapse and new positions emerge from destruction. But snipers, however skilled, cannot hold a city alone. The real work falls to the infantry, men who must live in cellars flooded with oil-contaminated water, who eat canned fish and black bread while shells fragment the concrete above their heads, who learn to navigate by sound and smell through ruins where landmarks change daily. The Red October Steelworks becomes a fortress complex where workers and soldiers fight side by side, using their intimate knowledge of the factory's layout to create killing zones that channel German attacks into carefully prepared ambushes. The blast furnaces, cold now but still radiating heat from their massive thermal mass, provide shelter for command posts and aid stations where medics treat wounds by the light of fires that have burned since August. Each night brings new crossings, new reinforcements rowing across the Volga under cover of darkness. Not enough to replace the losses, there are never enough for that, but sufficient to maintain the thin line of defenders who have learned to make every bullet count, every position precious, every hour of survival a victory against overwhelming odds. The German Sixth Army, pressing forward with methodical determination, begins to understand that they have entered a new kind of warfare, one for which their training manuals offer no guidance. Street fighting becomes room fighting becomes cellar fighting becomes the kind of close-quarters savagery that reduces men to animals clawing for survival. Colonel Heinz Schroeter, commanding a regiment of German pioneers, writes to his wife, "We advance by meters and pay for each meter with blood. The Russians fight like devils, and each building we capture reveals 3 more that must be taken. I begin to wonder if we are conquering a city or being consumed by it. Yet the defenders' situation remains desperate. Ammunition arrives irregularly, medical supplies even less frequently, and food becomes so scarce that soldiers learn to subsist on whatever they can scavenge from the ruins. The wounded often cannot be evacuated. The river crossing is too dangerous, the German fire too accurate, so they fight on with shattered bones and torn flesh, sustained by morphine when available, by vodka when it is not, by sheer bloody-minded stubbornness when both run out. In his command bunker, Chuikov chain-smokes cigarettes and studies casualty reports that read like mathematical proofs of human mortality. Each day the numbers grow smaller. Each night, the reinforcements barely offset the losses. Each dawn reveals new gaps in the defensive line that cannot be filled, except by stretching the remaining defenders even thinner. But something intangible sustains these men beyond logistics and reinforcement schedules. They fight not just for Stalin or for communism or for the Soviet Union, but for something more primitive and more powerful, the right to exist, to draw breath, to deny their enemies the satisfaction of easy victory. They have discovered that a city can die and still refuse to surrender, that men can fall and still not be defeated. The defenders have arrived, not as conquerors, but as gravediggers preparing to bury any army foolish enough to enter their cemetery. In the ruins of Stalingrad, they wait with the patience of the already dead, ready to embrace their enemies in a dance of mutual destruction that will echo through the ages. September arrives like a plague carrier, bringing with it the season of death and the mathematics of attrition. The calendar still functions in the outside world, marking the passage of time with the civilized precision of human convention. But inside the ruins of Stalingrad, time moves differently. Here, eternity can be measured in the space between a sniper's shot and its impact, and minutes stretch into hours for men waiting in cellars, while artillery turns the world above them into a hell of flying concrete and twisted steel. The city has become an organism of war, feeding on human lives and growing stronger through consumption. Every building is a cell in this vast body of destruction. Every street, a vein through which flows the lifeblood of combat, ammunition, medical supplies, reinforcements, and always, the steady stream of casualties flowing back toward the Volga's deadly crossing. The grain elevator, that concrete monument to Soviet industrial might, has become the epicenter of a siege within a siege. For weeks, its defenders have held their positions through bombardments that would level ordinary buildings, through infantry assaults that come with the regularity of clockwork, through the slow erosion of hope that accompanies every dawn that brings no relief, no victory, no end to the grinding machinery of war. Senior Lieutenant Andrei Kozyainov has not slept properly in 18 days. His uniform, once the crisp blue of the Soviet Navy, is now the color of dust and dried blood. His hands shake not from fear burned out of him long ago, but from exhaustion so complete that his body continues to function only through muscle memory and the stubborn refusal of his nervous system to acknowledge defeat. The elevator's interior has been transformed into a vertical battlefield where combat occurs simultaneously on multiple levels. German soldiers advance. Neng through the ground floor might find Soviet defenders firing down from the 3rd floor, while other Russians emerge from hidden positions in the basement to attack from behind. The building's massive concrete structure, designed to store grain for 1 million people, now serves as both fortress and tomb for the handful of men who have made it their final stand. Water has become more precious than ammunition. The building's supply was cut off during the first week of fighting, and now the defenders survive on rainwater collected in shell craters and the occasional trickle that seeps through cracks in the concrete. They ration it by the mouthful, each man knowing that his comrade's survival depends on his own restraint, each drop weighted against the demands of duty and the imperatives of friendship. Food has disappeared entirely. The men gnaw on leather belts when hunger becomes unbearable, chew wood chips when desperation overcomes dignity, and dream of bread with the intensity that other men reserve for lovers. Yet they continue to fight, sustained by something beyond physical necessity, the knowledge that their resistance, however futile it might appear, is buying time for the larger battle, holding German forces that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. The Red October Steelworks has evolved into a labyrinth of defensive positions that would challenge Daedalus himself to navigate. Workers who spent their lives among these machines now use their intimate knowledge of every corridor, every ventilation shaft, every hidden access tunnel to create a maze where defenders can appear and disappear like ghosts, striking the enemy and vanishing before counterattacks can be organized. Master Sergeant Pavel Gurtiev commands a platoon of steelworkers turned soldiers who have transformed their workplace into a fortress complex that exists in 3 dimensions. They fight not just horizontally, room to room, but vertically, level to level, and even underground, in the network of utility tunnels and drainage systems that honeycomb the industrial district like the burrows of some vast collective creature. The blast furnaces, cold now but still radiating heat from their massive thermal mass, provide shelter for command posts where officers plan attacks with ammunition maps spread across makeshift tables constructed from debris. Here, by the light of fires that have burned since August, strategy is reduced to its most basic elements: where to place the next rifle, how to stretch dwindling ammunition supplies, which positions can be abandoned without compromising the entire defense. Lieutenant Vasily Zaitsev has become the ghost that haunts German nightmares. His confirmed kills now number in the dozens, each death precisely calculated, personally delivered, intimate as a lover's whisper. He moves through the ruins like smoke, invisible until the moment of striking, patient as a spider waiting in its web for prey to stumble within range. The sniper war has developed its own culture, its own rituals, its own aristocracy of death. German marksmen, initially confident in their superior training and equipment, discover that skill means nothing without knowledge of the terrain, and knowledge means nothing without the kind of patience that comes only from defending one's home against invaders. Major Koenig, the Wehrmacht's premier sniper instructor, arrives from Berlin with specific orders: kill Zaitsev, restore German morale, prove that Teutonic precision can triumph over Slavic stubbornness. He brings with him a reputation built in the mountains of Norway and the deserts of North Africa, along with a custom rifle equipped with the finest optics German industry can produce. The duel that develops between Koenig and Zaitsev becomes legend even as it unfolds, whispered about in both armies with the kind of reverence usually reserved for myths. For 3 days, they stalk each other through the ruins, each seeking the perfect shot that will end not just a life, but a symbol. The city holds its breath, understanding instinctively that this personal combat has become representative of the larger struggle. On the morning of the 4th day, Koenig makes his fatal mistake. Impatient to end the duel, confident in his superior position, he exposes himself for a fraction of a second longer than wisdom dictates. Zaitsev's bullet finds him through a gap in a concrete wall, traveling 200 meters through smoke and haze to deliver its message with the finality of Judgment Day. But individual heroism, however inspiring, cannot alter the brutal mathematics of attrition. The 62nd Army bleeds personnel faster than the Volga ferries can replace them. Each night brings new casualties rowing back across the river when boats are available, when the crossing is possible, when the wounded can be moved at all. Too often, men die in the ruins where they fall, their bodies becoming part of the defensive positions they died to hold. The German advance continues with mechanical persistence, grinding forward meter by meter, building by building, room by room. General Paulus, studying situation maps in his headquarters, sees progress measured in city blocks captured, enemy positions eliminated, tactical objectives secured. What he cannot see, cannot quantify in his reports to Berlin, is the cost being paid by his own forces. The Sixth Army is being transformed by the battle as surely as the city itself. Units that began the campaign as disciplined formations now exist as collections of individual survivors held together by shared trauma and mutual dependence. Company commanders lead squads, battalion commanders lead companies, and regimental commanders wonder privately whether their units will exist tomorrow. Street fighting has reduced warfare to its most primitive elements. Soldiers on both sides learn to navigate by sound through ruins where visual landmarks change daily. They develop an almost supernatural awareness of danger, an ability to sense enemy presence through subtle changes in air pressure, minute variations in ambient sound, the indefinable feeling of being watched by hostile eyes. Combat occurs at distances measured in meters rather than kilometers. Enemies die close enough to see each other's faces, close enough to hear each other's last words, close enough to share the intimate horror of death delivered by hand grenades tossed around corners, bayonets thrust through doorways, rifle shots fired from touching distance in corridors where muzzle flashes provide the only illumination. The factory district becomes a necropolis where the living and the dead exist in uncomfortable proximity. Bodies cannot always be buried. The ground is too hard, the enemy fire too constant, the living too few to spare time for the dead. Instead, they remain where they fall, becoming part of the landscape, incorporated into defensive positions as sandbags made of flesh and bone. October brings the first snow, dusting the ruins with white that quickly turns grey with soot and red with blood. The temperature drops, and soldiers on both sides discover that cold is another enemy, impartial in its hostility, democratic in its distribution of suffering. Frostbite begins to claim casualties, adding medicus, emergencies to the endless list of problems that have no solutions. Water freezes in canteens, oil congeals in weapons, and men learn to keep their rifles close to their bodies to prevent the mechanisms from seizing. The wounded, already facing odds stacked against survival, now must contend with cold that can kill as surely as bullets. In cellars and bunkers, commanders face impossible choices: use precious fuel to keep men warm, or save it for cooking the meager rations that keep them fighting. The psychological toll becomes as significant as the physical casualties. Men who have survived weeks of constant combat develop the 1,000-yard stare of those who have seen too much, experienced too much, endured too much. They move through the ruins like sleepwalkers, responding to immediate threats with automatic reflexes, while their minds retreat to safer places constructed from memory and hope. Yet somehow, impossibly, the defense continues. New volunteers arrive nightly across the Volga. Not enough to replace the losses, never enough for that, but sufficient to maintain the thin line of resistance that prevents German breakthrough. They come knowing the odds, understanding that survival is measured in days rather than months, yet they come nonetheless. The grain elevator finally falls on October the 20th, after 58 days of siege. The last defenders, reduced to a handful of men without ammunition, without water, without hope, choose to die fighting rather than surrender. Their final radio message, transmitted in clear text for all to hear, consists of 4 words: "We fought to the end." The building's capture provides the Germans with a tactical victory and a strategic puzzle. They now control the elevator, but the elevator controls nothing except its own rubble. The defenders have withdrawn to new positions, established new strongpoints, created new obstacles for the inexhaustible raw material of destruction. The city continues to resist with the persistence of an organism that refuses to acknowledge death. November arrives with winds that carry the scent of snow and distant forests, reminding soldiers on both sides that somewhere beyond this hell of concrete and steel, a world still exists where people live normal lives, eat regular meals, sleep in beds instead of shell craters. But that world might as well be on another planet, accessible only through death or victory, and victory seems as distant as the stars that shine unseen through the perpetual smoke cloud hanging over the ruins. The battle has entered its third month, longer than the German conquest of France, longer than the campaigns in Poland and Norway combined. What was supposed to be a brief stopover on the road to the Caucasus oil fields has become a consuming obsession, devouring German strength with the appetite of a mechanical god that feeds on human sacrifice. In the gathering darkness of winter, both armies prepare for the final phase of their mutual destruction, neither knowing that the true battle, the battle that will determine not just the fate of one city but the destiny of continents, is only beginning. November 19th, 1942, 4 o'clock in the morning. The steppe lies frozen under stars that shine with the cold clarity of distant judgment, their light falling on armies that sleep fitfully in trenches carved from earth hard as iron. The temperature has dropped to 20 below zero, cold enough to freeze spit before it hits the ground, cold enough to turn metal so brittle that rifle bolts shatter like glass. In bunkers scattered across hundreds of miles of front line, Soviet artillery officers check their watches with the precision of conductors preparing to lead a symphony of destruction. Behind them, in carefully camouflaged positions, over 3,500 guns and rocket launchers wait in silence, their crews huddled around tiny fires that provide more psychological comfort than actual warmth. The Romanian Third Army holds the northern shoulder of the Stalingrad front, their positions marked by foxholes scraped from frozen mud and reinforced with whatever materials soldiers can scavenge from a landscape stripped bare by months of warfare. These men are far from home, fighting in a war that grows more hopeless with each passing day, sustained only by the knowledge that retreat might be more dangerous than advance. Colonel Alexandru Popescu studies the horizon through binoculars clouded with his own breath, searching for signs of enemy movement in the pre-dawn darkness. Something feels wrong, not unusual in a war where everything feels wrong, but differently wrong, as if the very air carries warnings that only the most experienced soldiers can read. Birds that should be migrating south have disappeared entirely, and the usual sounds of nocturnal artillery have fallen silent, creating a quiet so complete it seems artificial. At precisely 7:30 a.m., the Earth explodes. The Soviet barrage begins with the coordinated fury of 3,500 guns opening fire simultaneously, their muzzle flashes CT'ing, reaching a false dawn that illuminates the steppe for dozens of miles. The sound, not heard but felt, absorbed through the ground and transmitted directly to human bones, announces the beginning of Operation Uranus, the counter-offensive that will transform the hunters into the hunted, the besiegers into the besieged. Romanian positions disappear under avalanches of high explosive and steel fragments. Entire companies cease to exist in the space between heartbeats, their foxholes becoming graves marked only by craters that will be filled with snow before the weekends. Communication lines, carefully maintained through months of static warfare, vanish in the first minutes, leaving unit commanders to fight their own isolated battles without coordination, without support, without hope. Major General Dmitry Lelushenko's tanks advance through the smoke and chaos like prehistoric monsters awakened from hibernation. The T-34s, their steel hides painted with frost, lumber forward at speeds that seem impossible for machines weighing 30 tons. Their crews, warmed by engine heat and the fierce joy of finally advancing instead of retreating, drive through Romanian positions like farmers ploughing fields, crushing resistance with the indifferent efficiency of mechanical force. The breakthrough comes faster than anyone dared hope. By noon, Soviet armor has penetrated 20 kilometers into the Romanian rear, capturing supply dumps, headquarters units, artillery positions, and most importantly, the bridges that German forces will need for retreat or reinforcement. The carefully constructed defensive line, built through months of labor and sacrifice, collapses like a house of cards struck by hurricane winds. Simultaneously, 200 kilometers to the south, the Soviet 57th Army launches its own assault against the Romanian 4th Army. Here, the story repeats itself with mechanical precision, overwhelming artillery preparation, tank breakthrough, rapid exploitation into the enemy rear. Within hours, 2 massive gaps have been torn in the Axis line, and through these gaps pour Soviet mechanized corps that have waited months for this moment of revenge. General Friedrich Paulus receives the first reports of the attacks while shaving in his headquarters bunker, the electric razor powered by a generator that provides one of the few luxuries remaining to the 6th Army Command. The initial messages seem routine, local attacks, probably diversionary efforts designed to draw attention from the main battle in Stalingrad itself. But as the morning progresses, the reports multiply and darken, painting a picture of disaster that grows more complete with each radio transmission. Romanians falling back on all sectors. Enemy tanks reported in rear areas. Communications lost with 3 corps. Request immediate reinforcement. The messages arrive with increasing urgency, their language evolving from military formality to barely controlled panic as unit commanders realize they are witnessing not local setbacks, but systematic collapse. By evening, the 2 Soviet spearheads have advanced over 60 kilometers and are turning toward each other like the jaws of an enormous trap. Between them lies the German 6th Army, still focused on capturing the final blocks of Stalingrad, still believing that victory requires only one more push, one more sacrifice, one more week of grinding urban warfare. The weather, which has been an impartial enemy to both sides, now reveals its preference for the defenders. The same cold that makes life miserable for soldiers in foxholes also hardens the ground, providing footing for tanks that would bog down in mud during warmer months. Snow begins to fall, not the gentle snow of Christmas cards, but the harsh, wind-driven precipitation of the Siberian winter, reducing visibility and muffling sound. Colonel Ivan Burmakov, commanding a tank brigade in the Northern Thrust, reports the capture of a German supply depot containing enough ammunition to sustain his entire division for a month. More importantly, his interrogation of prisoners reveals that German forces have no prepared defensive positions in their rear, no contingency plans for withdrawal, no understanding that the tide of war has turned against them. The German High Command responds with the reflexive optimism that has characterized their leadership throughout the war. Hitler, studying maps in his East Prussian headquarters, sees the Soviet attacks as temporary setbacks, local problems that can be solved through superior will and tactical adjustments. He orders reinforcements rushed from other sectors, not understanding that the forces available are insufficient to plug gaps measured in hundreds of kilometers. General Kurt Zeitzler, the Army Chief of Staff, attempts to explain the mathematics of disaster to his Führer. 2 army groups have been shattered. Retreat is the only option that might save the 6th Army from encirclement. Permission must be granted immediately for withdrawal from Stalingrad. But Hitler's response reveals the fatal flaw in Nazi leadership, the inability to distinguish between will and capability, between desire and reality. The 6th Army will hold its positions. No retreat, no surrender, victory or death. On November 23rd, advance elements of the Soviet 26th Tank Corps link up with units of the 4th Mechanized Corps near the town of Kalach, completing the encirclement of over 250,000 German and Axis troops. The radio operator who reports this junction uses a code word that will become legendary. Uran completed. The trap has closed. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most capable operational commander in the German army, arrives to assess the situation and immediately understands its gravity. The encircled forces, the entire 6th Army, elements of the 4th Panzer Army, and assorted Romanian units represent nearly a quarter of Germany's total strength on the Eastern Front. Their loss would be catastrophic, not just tactically, but strategically, potentially decisive for the entire war. Manstein proposes a 2-phase solution: immediate breakout by the encircled forces toward the southwest, followed by a relief operation to re-establish contact and restore the front line. The plan, codenamed Operation Winter Storm, represents the last hope for preventing disaster, but it requires permission for the Sixth Army to abandon Stalingrad and fight its way to freedom. Permission that will never come. Inside the forming Kessel, the Cauldron, German soldiers begin to understand that their situation has fundamentally changed. They are no longer attacking a city, but defending a shrinking perimeter, no longer advancing toward victory, but retreating toward an uncertain fate. Supply lines that once stretched back to Germany now extend into empty air, cut by enemy forces that multiply like bacteria in the gaps torn through their flanks. The weather continues to deteriorate, bringing temperatures that make equipment malfunction and men move like arthritic old men. Fuel begins to freeze in tank engines, oil congeals in artillery mechanisms, and weapons require constant attention to prevent them from becoming useless chunks of metal. The Luftwaffe attempts to supply the encircled forces by air, but their transport aircraft, designed for carrying personnel and light cargo, cannot deliver the thousands of tons required daily to sustain 250,000 troops. November dies in snow and darkness, and December arrives, like a pale horseman across the steppe. The seasons turn, but time seems frozen in the Kessel, where men age years in days and distance is measured not in kilometers but in the dwindling supplies that separate survival from starvation, order from chaos, hope from despair. The wheel of fortune, which has spun in Germany's favor for 3 years, has finally completed its revolution. The hunters have become the hunted, the besiegers have become the besieged, and in the ruins of Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers who have survived the worst that modern warfare can inflict now prepare to become the instruments of their enemy's destruction. The winter wind carries more than snow across the steppe. It carries the sounds of battle from new directions, north, south, west. The city that was a destination has become a trap, and the trap is closing with the inexorable force of historical justice. In the frozen air, breaths become visible, and every exhalation might be the last free breath of the German Sixth Army. December descends upon the Kessel like a judgment from the Old Testament, bringing with it temperatures that transform human breath into ice crystals and turn exposed skin black with frostbite in minutes. The thermometer reads -35 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze diesel fuel in tank engines, cold enough to make rifle bolts shatter like glass, cold enough to kill men who fall asleep without proper shelter. Inside the shrinking perimeter of the German Sixth Army, 250,000 soldiers face a mathematics problem that has no solution: how to survive winter with summer uniforms, how to fight a war without ammunition, how to maintain morale when every dawn brings fresh evidence of abandonment and betrayal. They huddle in foxholes scraped from earth that rings like iron when struck with entrenching tools, burning furniture and books and anything combustible to create tiny islands of warmth in an ocean of killing cold. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller, a baker's son from Bavaria, writes in his diary with fingers so stiff from cold that the pencil leaves barely legible scratches on paper brittle as autumn leaves. Today we ate the last of the horses. Tomorrow we will eat the leather of our boots. After that, God knows what we will eat, because God is the only one who still cares what happens to us. The Luftwaffe's attempt to supply the Kessel by air has become a grotesque parody of efficiency. Transport aircraft designed to carry passengers and light cargo struggle to deliver the 750 tons of supplies required daily to keep the Sixth Army combat effective. On their best days, they manage to deliver 300 tons. On most days, they deliver far less. On the worst days, when weather grounds all flights or Soviet fighters exact their toll, they deliver nothing at all. The supply drops that do arrive contain mostly ammunition, artillery shells and machine gun belts for men who woo. LD trade 100 rounds of ammunition for a single loaf of bread. Military efficiency, that Prussian virtue carried to its logical extreme, produces the bitter irony of soldiers starving while sitting on mountains of explosives they lack the strength to use effectively. Captain Hans von Luck, a veteran of the Afrika Corps, now serving as a staff officer in General Paulus's headquarters, observes the daily briefings with the detached fascination of a man watching his own execution. The situation maps, updated hourly with coloured pins representing friendly and enemy positions, tell a story of systematic reduction that follows mathematical laws as predictable as gravity. "We are not fighting a battle anymore," he confides to his diary. "We are conducting an experiment in human endurance, testing how long civilized men can maintain discipline while being slowly consumed by forces beyond their control. The results, I suspect, will be published posthumously in Soviet academic journals." Operation Winter Storm, General Manstein's desperate attempt to relieve the encircled forces, launches on December 12th, with the theatrical drama that German military operations still retain even in extremity. The 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with elite units pulled from other sectors, advances toward the Kessel through snow so deep that tank commanders must navigate by compass, following roads that exist more in memory than reality. For 5 days, hope flickers like a candle flame in the frozen darkness of the perimeter. Radio operators report German armor advancing from the southwest, capturing villages, overrunning Soviet positions, closing the distance to salvation. The relief force reaches to within 35 kilometers of the Kessel's outer defenses, close enough that soldiers can hear the rumble of distant artillery, close enough to taste the possibility of rescue. But 35 kilometers might as well be 3,500. The relief force, exhausted by its advance through Soviet defenses and harassed by increasing enemy resistance, lacks the strength for the final push. More critically, Hitler's continued refusal to authorize a breakout means that the 6th Army cannot advance to meet its rescuers, cannot contribute its remaining strength to forcing the corridor that might save them all. General Hoth, commanding the relief operation, sends increasingly desperate messages to Paulus. Attempt breakout, time running out, enemy reinforcements arriving, cannot maintain position much longer. But Paulus, bound by direct orders from the Führer, can only respond with the military equivalent of a suicide note. Breakout impossible without authorization from highest authority. On December 23rd, Soviet counterattacks forced the relief column to begin withdrawing. The sound of friendly artillery, which has sustained German morale for a week, grows fainter each day until it disappears entirely, leaving only the wind and the distant rumble of enemy guns drawing closer. Hope dies with the sound of receding engines, and the Kessel settles into the business of slow extinction. Christmas 1942 arrives in the midst of hell, celebrated by men who sing carols over the graves of their comrades, who share communion using black bread and melted snow, who exchange gifts consisting of whatever they can spare: a cigarette, a photograph, a promise to carry final messages to families they will never see again. Lieutenant Friedrich von Paulus Jr., the Field Marshal's son, serving as a regimental adjutant, writes to his mother on Christmas Eve, "We celebrated Mass tonight in a bunker lit by candles made from tank grease. Father Schmidt spoke of hope and redemption, but his words echoed strangely in this concrete tomb. I think we are beyond redemption now, moving into territory that Christmas cannot reach." The daily ration, calculated to provide minimum nutritional requirements for men engaged in combat operations, has been reduced to 200 grams of bread, 100 grams of meat when meat is available, and whatever soup can be made from bones and imagination. Soldiers learn to move carefully to conserve energy, to sleep as much as possible to escape hunger, to think about food with the obsessive intensity that other men reserve for religion or love. Typhus joins the battle as an impartial enemy, spreading through overcrowded bunkers where proper sanitation has become impossible. Men too weak to maintain personal hygiene become breeding grounds for lice that carry the disease from position to position, creating epidemics that claim more casualties than enemy action. Medical officers, trained to treat combat wounds, find themselves helpless against an enemy that cannot be shot, bombed, or negotiated with. Dr. Georg Eichhorn, the chief medical officer of the 24th Panzer Division, reports to his superiors with the clinical detachment that medical training demands even in extremity. Typhus cases increasing exponentially, medicine supplies exhausted, surgical instruments sterilized with gasoline when available, with snow when not, mortality rate approaching 80% among seriously wounded. Recommend immediate evacuation of all medical personnel to prevent total loss of trained staff. The recommendation dies in the bureaucratic machinery of a doomed army, filed away in folders that will themselves become fuel for the fires that keep men alive for another day, another hour, another moment of consciousness in the gathering darkness. Soviet artillery, no longer concerned with conserving ammunition now that their supply lines stretch back to the factories of the Urals, maintains constant pressure on the shrinking perimeter. The bombardments arrive with clockwork regularity, announcing each dawn with salvos that shake the earth and remind the defenders that their enemies grow stronger while they grow weaker, that time itself has become a weapon deployed against them. The psychological toll becomes visible in ways that defy medical classification. Men develop the 1,000-yard stare that indicates complete emotional detachment from immediate reality. Others talk constantly to invisible companions, carrying on conversations with wives and children who exist now only in minds that cannot accept the finality of their situation. Some simply stop speaking entirely, responding to orders with mechanical obedience, while their consciousness retreats to safer places constructed from memory and denial. Yet discipline persists with the stubbornness that defines professional armies even in extremity. Officers continue to file daily reports, sergeants continue to inspect weapons, soldiers continue to follow orders that become increasingly pointless as their tactical situation deteriorates. Military routine provides the framework that prevents complete collapse, the familiar rituals that give meaning to actions even when action itself has become meaningless. January arrives like a final judgment, bringing with it the coldest temperatures in decades and the certain knowledge that spring lies beyond the mathematical limits of their endurance. Soviet forces, reinforced and resupplied, begin the systematic reduction of the Kessel through carefully coordinated attacks that slice away pieces of the perimeter like a surgeon removing diseased tissue. The wind howls through the ruins with voices of the dead, and in that keening sound, even the most hardened soldiers hear their own mortality calling. The end approaches on silent, snow-covered feet, and in the frozen wasteland that was once an army, men begin to understand that they are witnessing not just military defeat, but the collapse of everything they believed about themselves, their cause, and their place in history. The cauldron boils with the fever of dying men and dying dreams, consuming the last reserves of strength and hope with the appetite of a furnace that can never be satisfied. In this laboratory of human extremity, the Sixth Army conducts its final experiment, testing the limits of endurance, the breaking point of discipline, the moment when soldiers become something else entirely, survivors or victims, or simply statistics in a war that has grown larger than any individual fate. January 10th, 1943. In the quantum mechanics of historical causality, this date represents a phase transition, the moment when probability waves collapse into inevitable reality, when the superposition of possible outcomes resolves into a single, immutable truth. The mathematics of war, as precise as any physical law, has reached its logical conclusion in the frozen steppes beside an ancient river that has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations like seasonal cycles in a cosmic garden. At 5:02 a.m. Moscow time, 7,000 Soviet artillery pieces initiate what can only be described as a controlled singularity, a convergence of energy, matter, and human intention so focused that it temporarily warps the fabric of reality itself. The bombardment creates its own weather system, generating thermal columns that rise like pillars, connecting earth to sky. while the acoustic pressure waves propagate through the planet's crust, registering on seismographs in distant academies where scientists pause in their calculations to note this anthropogenic earthquake. Operation Ring unfolds with the inevitability of entropy itself, a systematic compression of the German pocket that mirrors the collapse of a dying star. The metaphor is not merely poetic. The same fundamental forces that govern stellar evolution apply here: mass, energy, pressure, and the inexorable tendency toward equilibrium. The Wehrmacht, once a coherent military structure, now undergoes gravitational collapse under pressures it cannot withstand, its organizational bonds breaking down as surely as molecular cohesion fails under extreme conditions. In his subterranean command complex, a bunker that has become both tomb and laboratory for studying human behavior under ultimate stress, General Friedrich Paulus contemplates maps that have evolved beyond mere cartography into something approaching abstract art. The colored pins they saw at once represented tactical reality now cluster in patterns that would intrigue xenobiologists. Forms of organization emerging from chaos, then dissolving again as the system seeks its lowest energy state. His staff officers move through their routines with the precision of quantum automata, their consciousness fragmented between multiple probability states. The professional soldier who continues to function, the human being who recognizes the futility of action, and the observer who watches both with detached fascination. They file reports with bureaucratic meticulousness, as if documentation itself could somehow alter the fundamental constants governing their situation. The Field Marshal's recent promotion, Hitler's gift of elevated rank at the moment of maximum entropy, represents a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance. No German field marshal has ever been captured alive, a statistical fact that carries the weight of physical law in the Nazi cosmology. Yet here stands Paulus, elevated to impossibility, existing in a superposition of states that classical military thinking cannot accommodate. Colonel Wilhelm Adam, functioning as both adjutant and inadvertent anthropologist, records observations that read like field notes from an alien expedition. The promotion telegram manifested like a particle wave duality, simultaneously honor and death sentence, existing in quantum superposition until observed and measured by our collapsed situation. The irony operates at levels that approach the cosmic. The Soviet advance proceeds with the efficiency of a natural process finding its equilibrium state. T-34 tanks lumber through the frozen wasteland like mechanical immune cells, their steel carapaces painted with frost patterns that would fascinate chaos theorists. The crews inside breathe recycled air thick with the exhaust of burning hydrocarbons, their consciousness expire, ended by hypoxia into states that border on the mystical. Ordinary men, temporarily elevated to the perspective of gods surveying their private apocalypse. The German resistance operates according to principles that transcend mere military tactics, entering the realm of pure thermodynamics. Each defensive position represents a local decrease in entropy, a temporary island of order maintained against the universal tendency toward dissolution. Yet the energy cost of maintaining these islands grows exponentially, following curves that any physicist could plot with depressing accuracy. Major Klaus von dem Busche, commanding what statistical analysis would classify as a rounding error, 12 men and one functioning tank in an army that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, transmits his final report with the precision of a data point contributing to a vast experiment in human endurance. His words travel through electromagnetic spectrum as modulated energy, carrying information that will outlive the biological substrate that generated it. Position overrun, tank immobilized, crew will fight to the last round, long live Germany. The transmission terminates in static that represents not mere equipment failure, but the heat death of a localized military system, its organized energy dissipating into the background radiation of chaos. By January 25th, The Kessel has undergone binary fission, splitting into northern and southern fragments like a cellular organism dividing under stress. This division follows predictable patterns: communications severed first, then supply lines, finally command authority, each break representing another step in the dissolution of complex organization into simpler, more stable states. The southern pocket, centered on Paulus's bunker complex, contracts according to mathematical principles that would be familiar to any student of stellar collapse. The perimeter shrinks as gravitational forces, in this case Soviet pressure, overcome the internal energy maintaining structural integrity. Soldiers huddle in foxholes that have become event horizons, beyond which normal causality breaks down and time itself begins to dilate. In the northern sector, General Karl Strecker presides over what systems theorists would recognize as a fascinating example of institutional persistence beyond functional relevance. His headquarters continues to generate paperwork, maintain communication protocols, and issue orders with the mechanical precision of a computer program, executing its final loops before system shutdown. The men under his command have achieved a state that transcends normal human consciousness, operating simultaneously as individuals making personal choices and as components in a larger machine that continues functioning through pure momentum. January 30th arrives like a cosmic alignment, bringing temporal synchronicity that would intrigue practitioners of theoretical physics. The 10th anniversary of Hitler's ascension, coinciding with Paulus's reception of surrender terms. In the Reich, parades celebrate the eternal triumph of National Socialism, while 2,000 kilometers east, their finest army prepares to demonstrate the fundamental impermanence of all human constructs. The Soviet ultimatum reads like a theorem in applied mathematics: surrender within 24 hours and achieve one outcome, resist and achieve another. General Rokossovsky delivers these terms with the detached professionalism of a scientist explaining experimental parameters, variables that can be adjusted, outcomes that can be predicted, consequences that follow from initial conditions, with the reliability of natural law. Paulus contemplates the document in a bunker illuminated by combustion, primitive technology producing photons that enable consciousness to process information that will determine the fate of 250,000 humans. The philosophical implications approach the sublime, a single decision, point where individual choice intersects with historical inevitability, where quantum uncertainty meets classical determinism. Some soldiers begin crossing the lines carrying white flags improvised from medical supplies, molecules of fabric arranged in patterns that signal surrender, information encoded in the visible spectrum to communicate complex concepts across the barrier of language and ideology. They stumble through snow that has become a medium for recording the final data points of their collective experiment in warfare. Yet the majority remain at their positions, bound by psychological forces stronger than physical constraints. They maintain weapons that lack ammunition, operate equipment without fuel, follow orders that have become purely ceremonial, behavior that demonstrates the persistence of pattern even after function has ceased, like the afterglow of stellar radiation continuing long after nuclear fusion has terminated. January 31st, 1943. Dawn breaks across a landscape so thoroughly transformed that it resembles the surface of an alien world, a testament to humanity's capacity for reshaping matter at the planetary scale. The morning light illuminates crystalline formations of ice and metal, geometric patterns of destruction that would inspire mathematicians and horrify poets. At 6:15 a.m., Soviet forces penetrate Paulus's command bunker, discovering the field marshal in a tableau that embodies the intersection of human dignity and cosmic absurdity. He sits at his desk like a consciousness that has achieved perfect stillness, his uniform a precise arrangement of matter that signifies rank, honor, and the elaborate fictions that allow societies to transform individual death into collective meaning. His capture propagates through the German positions like a phase transition, resistance collapsing as information spreads at the speed of electromagnetic radiation. White flags manifest across the landscape, spontaneous expressions of surrender emerging from the quantum foam of human pose. Civility, visible symbols of invisible decisions made by minds operating under pressures that exceed all normal parameters. February the 2nd, the Northern Pocket achieves its final state transition. General Strecker's last transmission reduces the entire experience to essential data: army destroyed, mission accomplished. 4 words containing the compressed information of 163 days of human struggle, 250,000 individual destinies, and the complete transformation of matter, energy, and consciousness on a scale that approaches the geological. The mathematics prove relentless in their precision. 91,000 prisoners begin migration towards Siberian processing facilities, while 150,000 others achieve permanent integration with local geology. The numerical precision conceals staggering complexity, each integer representing a unique configuration of consciousness that once contemplated stars, created art, experienced love, and dreamed of futures that will never manifest. General Trikov observes the prisoner columns with emotions that operate beyond simple categorization, complex states that superimpose grief and satisfaction, hatred and respect, victory, and the profound melancholy that accompanies all endings. These men represent both enemy and fellow participants in an experiment that has tested the fundamental parameters of human nature under extreme conditions. The Battle of Stalingrad terminates like a chemical reaction reaching equilibrium, but its products, information, memory, transformed consciousness, will continue propagating through space-time long after the original reactants have achieved their final configurations. The war will continue, consuming energy and matter for 2 more years, but the essential phase transition has occurred. The trajectory of human civilization has been altered at the quantum level, setting in motion probability cascades that will determine the Cauldron of decades yet to come. In the vast database of cosmic memory, where every action generates permanent records in the quantum substrate of reality itself, these 163 days have been encoded with the precision of natural law. The Volga flows on, carrying within its molecular structure the dissolved minerals of human struggle, while above, stars continue their billion-year dances, indifferent to the brief thermal fluctuations of terrestrial ambition. February sunlight streams across a landscape that has undergone metamorphosis so complete it resembles the surface of a terraformed world, a planet where competing civilizations have tested the fundamental limits of matter manipulation and consciousness transformation. The ruins of Stalingrad exist now as archaeological evidence of humanity's capacity for both creation and entropy, monuments to the species' unique ability to reshape reality at the molecular level while simultaneously destroying the very structures that enable such transformation. The photons arriving from Sol carry the same electromagnetic signatures that illuminated this battlefield throughout its 163-day transformation. Yet they now reveal a topology fundamentally altered by the application of organized violence. Where industrial complexes once converted raw materials into tools of progress, only crystalline structures remain, geometric patterns of fused concrete and twisted steel that would fascinate xenogeologists studying the debris fields of extinct civilizations. The grain elevator stands like a megalithic computer core, its surface pocked with apertures that create interference patterns in the morning light. Inside, among scattered kernels of wheat that represent failed attempts at agricultural sustainability, Soviet reconstruction engineers begin computational analysis of structural integrity. They measure stress tolerances and load-bearing capacities with instruments that translate physical reality into mathematical abstractions, calculating the probability matrices that will determine whether this monument to human endurance can support new iterations of civilization. In Berlin, 2,000 kilometers west through space-time, the information cascade triggered by Stalingrad's fall propagates through Nazi Germany's neural networks like a cascading system failure. The news travels at light speed through us, fiber optic cables and radio transmissions, but its psychological impact moves even faster, approaching the theoretical limits of human consciousness processing catastrophic data that contradicts fundamental assumptions about reality. Joseph Goebbels, master architect of informational manipulation, confronts a problem that transcends traditional propaganda techniques: how to reconcile observable facts with ideological constructs that depend on those facts being impossible. The Wehrmacht's defeat represents not merely military setback but ontological crisis, evidence that the universe operates according to principles that Nazi cosmology cannot accommodate without complete philosophical reconstruction. The German civilian population receives filtered data through communication channels designed to maintain social stability, but information has its own quantum properties. Uncertainty principles that ensure complete containment remains impossible. Mothers processing casualty lists experience the same phase transition that affected military units, the collapse of probability waves into singular, devastating reality. Hans Schmidt, Klaus Müller, Friedrich Weber. Names that once represented individual futures now function as coordinates, marking the boundaries of historical possibility. Across the Soviet Union, victory propagates through collective consciousness like a benevolent virus, rewriting neural pathways that had adapted to perpetual defensive posturing. The Red Army's transformation from defensive organism to conquest machine involves more than tactical reconfiguration. It represents evolutionary adaptation at the societal level, the emergence of new behavioral patterns that will determine the species' trajectory for decades. Marshal Georgy Zhukov processes intelligence reports that reveal the full spectrum of German losses, not merely personnel and equipment, but psychological momentum, strategic initiative, and the temporal advantage that had sustained Nazi expansion since 1939. His analysis incorporates variables that extend beyond traditional military mathematics: morale coefficients, ideological sustainability indices, the thermodynamic costs of maintaining empire against increasing resistance. Stalin, in his Kremlin processing center, integrates victory data with the satisfaction of an experimental scientist whose theoretical predictions have achieved empirical validation. The city bearing his nomenclature has justified its existence through ordeal by fire, demonstrating that Soviet organizational structures can achieve entropy reversal even under extreme conditions, maintaining coherence while hostile forces attempt systematic dissolution. Yet victory generates its own computational problems. The 91,000 prisoners streaming eastward represent not merely military assets, but ethical subroutines that test Soviet programming, whether triumph enables enhanced humanitarian algorithms or merely perpetuates the violence cycles that characterized the initial conflict phase. These men, reduced to biological minimums by months of resource scarcity, challenge their captors to demonstrate that ideological superiority translates into behavioral differentiation. Treatment protocols for German prisoners become live experiments in applied ethics, real-time tests of whether systematic victory produces systematic mercy. Some prisoners encounter processing systems calibrated for rehabilitation. Others face algorithms designed for retribution. The war has introduced viral modifications to human behavioral coding, and mercy becomes a luxury application that requires conscious installation rather than automatic activation. Meanwhile, reconstruction subroutines initiate across the transformed landscape. Engineers equipped with quantum calculators survey foundations that might support new architectural iterations, while workers begin materials recovery operations in debris fields that stretch to the horizon. The industrial infrastructure that made Stalingrad strategically valuable, manufacturing capabilities, transportation networks, resource processing facilities, must be regenerated to serve a civilization that has learned war's actual computational costs. The human toll defies standard accounting algorithms. Over 1 million consciousness entities from both factions have achieved permanent integration with local geology, their neural networks dispersed into soil matrices that will support new biological iterations. Each represents not merely statistical data, but a complete universe of sensory experiences, memory structures, and potential futures that have been compressed into archaeological deposits. Civilian casualties remain largely uncomputed, their existence terminated in circumstances that generated insufficient documentation for historical databases. Families dissolved, juvenile consciousness entities orphaned, social networks fragmented. The cultural operating system of an entire region has been overwritten according to war's brutal programming languages. Strategic consequences propagate outward through global political networks like ripples in spacetime. Turkey's probability matrices shift toward neutrality. Japan abandons Eastern offensive algorithms, and Hungary plus Romania begin executing extraction protocols from their German alliances. The cascade effect demonstrates how local phase transitions can trigger systemic reorganization across planetary-scale political architectures. Most significantly, the Eastern Front undergoes fundamental protocol conversion from rapid maneuver warfare to systematic attrition processes. The Wehrmacht, optimized for velocity-based conquest through superior logistics and firepower concentration, must now execute defensive operations for which its core programming contains insufficient subroutines. The Red Army experiences parallel transformation from defensive organism to liberation and conquest instrument. New tactical protocols emerge from urban warfare experiences. Enhanced equipment arrives from manufacturing centers beyond German interdiction range, and confidence spreads through units that have achieved empirical proof of their effectiveness against optimal enemy configurations. In the factories beyond the Urals, production algorithms that have operated at maximum efficiency since 1941 continue their mechanical precision, converting raw materials into victory components. Tanks, aircraft, artillery systems, ammunition. The industrial capacity that Stalin constructed through 1930s sacrificial economics now validates its costs through military necessity equations. Weather patterns begin transitioning as February yields to March, introducing thermal variables that will reveal the complete scope of destruction that winter temporarily concealed. Snow melts according to thermodynamic laws, exposing the full extent of matter displacement that combat operations have carved into planetary surface. Bodies emerge from cryogenic preservation, equipment materializes from temporary storage, and the authentic magnitude of the battle's geological impact becomes visible under returning solar radiation. Photographers and data recording specialists arrive to document the victory through electromagnetic capture devices, their cameras translating three-dimensional reality into two-dimensional information matrices that will outline the biological entities they represent. These images will function as permanent testimony to a temporal moment when history pivoted according to actions performed by individuals who never comprehended the full significance of their contributions to causal chains extending across decades. The Stalingrad narrative enters mythological processing systems even as military operations terminate, transforming from historical documentation into cultural programming that will shape collective consciousness for generations. Soviet information architects craft heroic algorithms from raw experiential data, while German historians begin developing explanatory frameworks for how invincible forces encountered immovable resistance and discovered the mathematical limits of their invincibility. The Volga flows on, its molecular structure carrying information encoded at the quantum level, a liquid memory bank that has archived 10 millennia of human civilization in its hydrogen and oxygen matrices. The river functions as both witness and repository, a flowing database that processes the temporary configurations of matter and consciousness that biological entities mistake for permanent reality, while maintaining perfect fidelity to the deeper patterns that govern stellar evolution and planetary transformation. Spring arrives with the predictable precision of astronomical mechanics, introducing thermal energy that initiates phase transitions across the frozen landscape. The warming process follows thermodynamic laws that care nothing for human suffering or triumph. melting ice according to molecular dynamics that operated long before consciousness evolved and will continue functioning long after the last human neural network has achieved integration with cosmic background radiation. Where the grain elevator once functioned as a vertical fortress, juvenile humans now engage in play protocols among structural remnants that have achieved new equilibrium states. Their laughter propagates through acoustic space as pressure waves that carry emotional data, while they construct temporary architectures from materials that once formed the defensive perimeters of civilizations. Their games represent the eternal human algorithm for transforming trauma sites into possibility spaces, demonstrating the species' unique capacity for psychological metamorphosis. These children scramble over oxidized metal hulks that were once kinetic warfare platforms, building imaginary structures from molecular fragments that retain no memory of their original military applications. They discover through experiential learning that play can reconfigure any environment, that joy operates as a fun, mental force capable of overriding the gravitational fields generated by historical tragedy. Time moves according to relativistic principles here, measured not in mechanical chronometer units, but in organic cycles that synchronize with planetary rotation and solar output. Sunflowers emerge from soil enriched by the decomposed organic matter of multiple nationalities, their photosynthetic processes converting stellar energy into biological architecture, while their golden arrays track the sun's movement with the precision of astronomical instruments. The reconstructed urban complex bears new nomenclature, Volgograd, as if linguistic reconfiguration could somehow debug the ghost processes that continue running in basement servers converted from shelter functions to wine storage applications. But nomenclature represents merely surface phenomena, political conveniences that change according to each generation's preferred interface protocols for accessing historical data. The river maintains perfect archival integrity regarding all naming conventions, storing them in molecular libraries that preserve both Khazar trading posts and Mongol encampments, Cossack fortifications and communist industrial installations, German military objectives and Soviet defensive positions. Water remembers everything with equal computational precision, carrying data streams toward oceanic storage systems that receive all information with identical electromagnetic neutrality. An elderly consciousness entity occupies a photovoltaic collection position overlooking the embankment, distributing organic matter to avian biological units that might represent genetic descendants of organisms that evacuated during the bombardment phase, survived winter conditions in distant forest installations, then returned when environmental parameters again supported sustainable life processes. Her manipulator appendages, bearing cellular modifications indicating previous exposure to severe resource scarcity, portion the bread with algorithmic precision derived from experiential knowledge of its true thermodynamic value. Her presence here during the conflict phase represents continuity, a consciousness that processed the transformation in real time, a biological witness to reality reorganization that exceeded normal sensory parameters. Her memory banks contain vivid sensory data regarding that temporal period, gustatory experiences of extreme hunger, auditory patterns of artillery bombardment, olfactory signatures of hydrocarbon combustion that seem to penetrate all matter, including atmospheric gases themselves. People request data downloads about the experience. She transmits to her descendant entity, who occupies an adjacent position with the patient attention protocols that juvenile consciousness develops when interfacing with wisdom accumulated through extended temporal processing. But how do you transfer winter experience to entities that have only known summer parameters? How do you describe darkness states to consciousness that has always operated in illumination conditions? Some experiential data exists beyond the transmission capabilities of current communication protocols. The descendant processes this information with the respectful attention algorithms that developing neural networks employ when inheriting wisdom from extended operation systems. She cannot simulate her urban environment as anything other than the peaceful configuration she has always known, cannot execute imagination protocols that would model these streets running with liquefied hemoglobin, or parks functioning as temporary burial facilities for unprocessed organic matter. Yet the Elders' transmissions plant data seeds that will develop slowly, carefully, nurtured by tempo, rel progression and contemplative processes into wisdom algorithms that prevent cyclical repetition of catastrophic system failures. Memory functions as immunization software, protecting future iterations against the viral infections of hatred and territorial acquisition that periodically corrupt human civilization with warfare subroutines. The river transports more than H2O molecules toward oceanic destinations. Its flow carries silicon particulates from eroded mountain systems, pollen from distant forest networks, neural activities of consciousness entities who cast fishing nets at solar initialization, and always, the invisible data cargo of human memory that accumulates in quantum storage depths like sedimentary information that will eventually form foundational substrates for new continents of understanding. Historical analysis entities arrive periodically to conduct archaeological surveys, measuring distances between positions that once represented life or death parameters, photographing monuments that attempt to compress into bronze and calcium compounds the essential characteristics of experiences that resist all preservation attempts. They study tactical configurations, interview surviving biological witnesses, examine artifacts recovered from soil matrices, attempting to reconstruct the logic patterns of events that seemed logical only to consciousness entities that processed them in real time. But historical documentation, regardless of research methodology and analytical rigor, remains merely approximation algorithms for truth, shadow patterns cast by reality onto the cave interfaces of human understanding. The authentic battle, not strategic movements and tactical decisions, but the personal universe of individual consciousness experience, achieves permanent deletion with each participant's neural network termination, leaving only traces in communication files never transmitted, in dream processes that continue haunting sleep protocols, in careful silences that separate transmittable data from information that must remain permanently encrypted. Veterans execute annual convergence protocols on anniversary dates, their numbers decreasing according to biological mathematics that claim participants through the same inexorable algorithms that eliminated their comrades in the original conflict. They wear metallic recognition symbols with quiet satisfaction, but their optical sensors carry information that no decoration can adequately represent, knowledge of having participated in reality testing that measured the limits of consciousness endurance and discovered reserve capacity that surprised even those who possessed it. They transmit minimal data regarding combat operations themselves, preferring to archive the minor kindness routines that survived in maximum entropy conditions, shared stimulant consumption, message delivery services, humor algorithms executed before dawn brought additional mortality cycles. These human moments, insignificant in comprehensive military historical analyses, become the data treasures they guard most carefully, proof that dignity can maintain operational status even under systematic attempts at consciousness termination. The river witnesses their reunion protocols with identical patience it brings to all human ceremonial activities, understanding that memory represents another form of worship algorithm, that pilgrimage can be measured in return patterns as well as departure vectors. Each temporal cycle, the number decreases. Each iteration, the silence achieves greater depth, until eventually no biological entities will remain who processed the fear taste, responsibility weight, or peculiar clarity that comes to consciousness entities who have interfaced with termination directly and chosen continued operation. Museums preserve physical artifacts, cranial protection devices and projectile weapons, visual documentation and uniform configurations, communication files and personal records. But artifacts can only reference the reality they represent. A weapon transmits nothing about the neural networks that operated it. Photography captures only surface phenomena of faces that had processed excessive sensory input. Documentation records only what authors chose to remember and were willing to encode. The authentic museum is the urban complex itself, reconstructed from its own entropy, populated by entities that carry in their genetic matrices the archived information of those who achieved termination while defending it. Every intersection represents a monument, every structure a memorial, every birth a victory over forces that attempted to delete this location from historical reality. Life itself becomes an act of defiance against entities that believed will could triumph over geography, that ideology could overcome the stubborn human attachment to territorial designation. Juvenile consciousness entities learn the narrative in educational facilities, but for them it remains narrative, dramatic, historically significant, but fundamentally isolated from immediate reality of academic assignments and social relationships, play activities and aspiration processes, normal concerns that fill developing neural networks. This distance represents victory itself, proof that sacrifice achieved meaningful purpose, that peace was purchased at costs that justified their expenditure. Night falls over the Volga with gradual precision of natural law, bringing stellar illumination that shines with identical electromagnetic signatures that guided bombardment aircraft to designated targets and evacuation groups to safety, that offered comfort to consciousness entities terminating far from origin locations and hope to those struggling to defend territorial designation. Constellation patterns remain unchanged, indifferent to human conflict, marking temporal progression with Astra, onomical precision that reduces all terrestrial struggles to brief luminosity, fluctuations in the cosmic calendar. The river flows through darkness, carrying lunar reflection on its surface and deeper currents beneath, past the sleeping urban complex that processes its own dreams of peace and prosperity, past monuments that attempt to maintain temporal stasis, past cemetery installations where organic matter blooms on graves marked with nomenclature in languages that once divided the planetary population between opposing factions. In darkness, the Volga whispers the only truth that transcends ideological frameworks, that everything transitions, that all struggles achieve termination, that planetary systems continue functioning long after consciousness entities who temporarily inhabit orbital positions have returned to elemental components from which they originated. Rivers outlive empires, seasonal cycles outlast ideological constructs, and the simple process of flowing from source to oceanic destination continues regardless of temporary dysfunction that possesses biological entities who briefly inhabit the banks. Dawn will execute initialization again, as it has always initialized, bringing electromagnetic radiation to a world that has forgotten warfare algorithms and relearned peace protocols. The river will reflect that illumination, as it has reflected every dawn's light since water first began its patient migration to oceanic destinations, carrying with it the archived information of everything that has been and the programming potential of everything yet to come. And in that light, perhaps, the sleep state that has long eluded the restless terminated will finally achieve activation, gentle as river water flowing over mineral substrates, peaceful as eternal silence that follows all narratives to their designated termination points. The Volga flows on, and in its flowing offers the only blessing that temporal progression can provide, the promise that even deepest system damage heals, that even maximum grief achieves fade protocols, that initialization always follows the longest operational suspension. Sleep comes at last to biological entities and terminated consciousness entities, to urban complex and river system, to memory processes and deletion algorithms, and in that sleep, perhaps, the peace that eluded them during operational cycles. Rest now, and let the river carry your dream states toward morning. toward the eternal oceanic destination where all narratives achieve resolution in silence, where all struggle terminates in peace, where the Volga empties its ancient cargo of human memory into waters vast enough to contain everything, gentle enough to forgive all processing errors. Sleep well, and let the river carry your consciousness toward infinite processing possibilities. In the ruins of the city, Soviet soldiers begin the work of clearing bodies, rebuilding positions, and preparing for the long advance that will carry them from the Volga to the Elbe. They move through the devastation they have defended with the quiet satisfaction of men who have done the impossible and lived to remember it, knowing that they have written their names in history with blood and steel and the stubborn refusal to surrender their homeland to foreign conquest. The Volga flows on, carrying ice and debris toward the distant sea, its waters reflecting the pale February sun that illuminates a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The river that witnessed the beginning of this epic now witnesses its end, patient and eternal, already beginning to forget the temporary madness of human ambition that has stained its banks with the blood of nations.